When we talk about growing up feeling unloved, most people picture something obvious. They picture absence, neglect, a childhood with visible holes in it, the parent who wasn't there, the home that was visibly broken, the kind of story that is easy to recognize as difficult. But the experience of growing up feeling unloved is far more common and far more ordinary than that picture suggests. It belongs to children who were fed and clothed and driven to school. Children whose parents, if asked, would have said without hesitation that they loved them. Children who had no dramatic story to tell and yet grew up with something missing that they couldn't quite name. It belongs to the child whose emotional needs were consistently met with distraction or dismissal, or simply the blank wall of a parent who didn't know how to be present in that way. The child who learned very early that their feelings were inconvenient, that their needs were too much, that love, when it came with conditions attached. Today we're looking at 10 psychological traits that develop when a child grows up in that kind of environment. Traits that don't look like wounds from the outside. Traits that look like personality, like independence, like simply who you are. Because the most lasting effects of feeling unloved in childhood are the ones we stop recognizing as effects. There is a distinction that psychology makes that is essential to everything that follows. The difference between being loved and feeling loved. A parent can love their child with complete sincerity, can have the feeling of love, while being entirely unable to communicate that love in a way the child can receive. Love that is not expressed in ways the child can understand and feel is, from the child's developmental perspective, effectively absent. Not because it doesn't exist, but because the nervous system of a developing child cannot be nourished by love it cannot feel. Children are not equipped to say, "My parent loves me but is unable to express it in the ways I need." What they are equipped to say, what their nervous system concludes in the absence of felt love, is, "I am not loved." And from there, the next conclusion. There is something about me that makes me not worth loving. Developmental psychologist Diana Baumrein's research on parenting styles and John Bowlby's foundational work on attachment theory both converge on the same point. What matters most for a child's psychological development is not the love the parent holds inside, but the love the child experiences from the outside, the attunement, the presence, the consistent sense of being wanted and welcome. When that experience is missing, not always, not dramatically, but consistently enough, the child builds an internal model of themselves and of love that will shape every relationship they form for decades to come. Let's look at what that model produces. Trait 1. A tendency to interpret neutral events as rejection. A friend doesn't reply immediately. Someone's tone in an email seems slightly different than usual. A person you care about seems quieter than normal in a group setting. And before a single piece of evidence supports it, your nervous system has already returned a verdict. They're pulling away. Something is wrong. They're angry or disappointed or done with you. From the outside, this looks like insecurity, like reading too much into things, like someone who is oversensitive to social dynamics. But the psychological mechanism underneath it is specific and traceable. When a child grows up in an environment where love was unreliable, where the emotional climate could shift without warning, where attunement from a caregiver was inconsistent, the nervous system learns to scan for signs of withdrawal. Not because the child is naturally paranoid, but because in their early environment, detecting the first signs of emotional withdrawal early was genuinely useful. It gave them time to adapt, to adjust, to do whatever needed to be done to keep the connection intact. What was adaptive then becomes distorting now. The hypervigilance that was calibrated to an environment of emotional unpredictability continues to run in an adult world that is often simply neutral. The friend who didn't reply was in a meeting. The quiet colleague was tired. The different tone in the email meant nothing, but the nervous system that was trained in conditions of love's instability doesn't know how to read neutrality as neutrality. It reads it as threat. And so the adult who grew up feeling unloved moves through ordinary social interactions carrying the emotional residue of every time love was uncertain in childhood. Trait 2. Difficulty believing that people who love you actually mean it. Someone tells you that you matter to them, that they love you, that being around you makes their life better, and you hear it, you register it, and somewhere, just beneath the surface of the receiving, a small voice says, "Not really, not permanently, not when they find out the full version. On the surface, this looks like humility, like not being arrogant about your place in people's lives, like realistic caution about trust. But what it actually reflects is one of the most consistent psychological findings about people who grew up feeling unloved: the inability to fully internalize love, even when it is present, even when it is genuine, even when it is freely given. The reason is architectural. When we grow up in an environment of felt love, we build what psychologists call an internal working model of ourselves as lovable. This model is what allows us to hold love we've received in our minds even when the person isn't in the room, to carry it with us, to draw on it, to feel its weight even in absence. When that environment of felt love was absent or inconsistent, the model that gets built is different. It is a model of the self as fundamentally not quite enough. And so, when love arrives in adulthood, real, present, freely given, it lands on a foundation that doesn't know how to hold it. It slides off. It feels temporary. It feels conditional, because all the love this person ever knew was. The love people offer you in your adult life may be entirely real. The difficulty holding it isn't a statement about them. It is the fingerprint of an early environment that didn't teach you that you were someone love could stay with. Trait 3. A powerful drive to earn love through achievement or usefulness. You're good at what you do, perhaps very good, and you work hard, harder, often than the situation requires. There is a drive in you that other people notice and sometimes admire, though you might find it difficult to simply enjoy. On the surface, this looks like ambition, like being motivated, driven, someone who takes pride in their work. But underneath many high-achieving adults who grew up feeling unloved is a belief that was formed very early, that love is something you earn, not something you are given, that your value is contingent on your performance. That approval, the closest thing to love you learn to expect, arrives after the achievement, not before it, and disappears if the achievement stops. Children who receive love conditionally, who notice that warmth from a parent arrives when they succeed and withdraws when they fail, or who learn that being useful is what makes them welcome, internalize that equation. Love equals performance. Worth equals output. Being is not enough. Doing is what earns the right to exist in someone's affection. The adult who carries this belief doesn't know rest. Not real rest, not the kind that involves no contribution, no productivity, no evidence of value. They are uncomfortable in moments that don't generate worth. They struggle to simply be around people without also being useful to them. The achievement is real. The capability is real. But the engine driving it is not ambition in the simple sense. It is the child who learned that love had to be earned, who never stopped believing that stopping the earning would mean losing the love. Trait 4. The ability to read a room and the exhaustion that comes with it. You walk into a room and you know things. You know when the energy is shifted, when two people have just had a disagreement, when someone is performing calm they don't feel. You read it in posture, in tone, in the micropauses between words. Most people walk into the same room and notice nothing, On the surface, this looks like empathy, like being perceptive, emotionally attuned, gifted at reading social situations, and it is those things. But the origin of this gift is not a natural gift at all. It is a learned survival skill. Children who grow up in environments where a parent's emotional state was unpredictable, where the household climate could shift with the parent's mood, where safety or affection depended on reading the adult correctly, develop what researchers call hypervigilant social monitoring. The nervous system, calibrated to an environment where emotional misreading had real consequences, becomes extraordinarily sensitive to every available signal of another person's inner state. It is a form of intelligence that was paid for with childhood anxiety. Every adult who carries it also carries the exhaustion that is its shadow, the exhaustion of never being able to simply be in a room without also monitoring it, of carrying the background hum of emotional surveillance that doesn't have an off switch because it was installed before the child had a choice about whether they needed it. The empathy is real. The perception is genuinely valuable, but it was built in response to the need to survive an emotionally unpredictable environment, and it costs more to maintain than anyone who hasn't lived with it can easily understand. Trait 5. A low-grade belief that you are fundamentally too much or not enough. It's not a sharp thought. It doesn't arrive with a specific memory or a clear piece of evidence. It's more like a background frequency, a low, persistent hum underneath ordinary life that says you are somehow off. You are somehow too much or not enough, or both at different moments. You might have spent years trying to locate the source of it, wondering if it is depression or anxiety or simply your personality. Wondering if everyone feels this way and you are simply more aware of it. On the surface, when this belief drives behavior, it can look like conscientiousness or self-awareness, or simply being hard on yourself in the way high-achieving people often are. But the specific quality of feeling fundamentally deficient, not in a particular skill or area but in your basic self, is one of the most documented psychological legacies of growing up in an environment where love was withheld or conditional. Because children, as we have said, cannot attribute the failure of love to the parent. Their developmental architecture requires them to turn the explanation inward. If I am not being loved fully, the conclusion the child's mind reaches is not, this parent is limited. It is, there is something about me. That conclusion hardens over time. It becomes the lens through which the self is seen, not as a fixed conscious belief, but as an ambient assumption about what kind of person you are and what you can expect to receive. And because it was formed before language and before reason, it resists logical challenge. You can know intellectually that you are worthy of love and still feel in the body like something is fundamentally not quite right. That feeling is not the truth. It is the residue of someone else's limitation misattributed to you. Trait 6. Loving intensely but holding something back at the same time. You love people, genuinely, deeply, sometimes in a way that surprises you with its intensity. You're not someone who does not know how to love, but there is a part of you, not the whole, but a part, that stays slightly back, that does not fully arrive into the love, even when the love is real and the person is worthy of it. That remains at some level ready for the love to change or end or reveal a condition you hadn't seen yet. On the surface, this can look like maturity, like not losing yourself in relationships, like maintaining healthy boundaries. But the specific quality of loving with one foot slightly outside, of intimacy that reaches a certain depth and then, almost involuntarily holds, is something that psychologists recognize as a characteristic pattern in people with anxious or avoidant attachment, both of which are strongly associated with early experiences of unreliable love. The child who loved a parent whose love was inconsistent learned that full surrender to love was dangerous, that the deepest attachment was also the deepest exposure. And so a protective mechanism developed. Love, but retain some distance. Connect, but keep an exit. Be present, but not completely. This is not a failure of love. It is love's self-protection. It is what love looks like when it learned early that its fullest expression led to the greatest hurt. The people in your life who love you and feel you holding back are not wrong, but what they're feeling is not unwillingness. It is the shape of love that learned to protect itself. Trait 7. Struggling to ask for what you need, or to know what you need. Someone asks you what you need, what would help, what you want right now. And you pause, not to consider between options, but because the question, simple as it is, has no immediate answer available to you. Or you know you need something, but you cannot bring yourself to ask for it. The asking feels too much like demanding, like being a burden, like imposing a need that other people shouldn't have to meet. On the surface, this looks like being low maintenance, like being easy, like someone who doesn't make a fuss. But there are two distinct mechanisms here that share the same origin. The first is the erosion of knowing. In families where a child's needs were consistently unmet or minimized, the child eventually stops generating clear signals to themselves about what they need. The need arises, meets no response, and eventually the signaling system becomes less reliable, because signaling needs that go unmet is a form of repeated disappointment that the nervous system learns to protect against. The second is the suppression of asking. Even when the need is known, the act of asking feels loaded with risk. What if the asking is too much? What if it changes how someone sees you? What if it is met with the withdrawal, the sigh, the dismissal, the barely hidden inconvenience that you learned early on to expect? Knowing what you need and being able to ask for it are skills. They are skills learned in childhood, in environments where needs were modeled as acceptable, where asking was met with warmth rather than burden. When that environment wasn't there, the skills don't fully develop. The difficulty you have is not a character flaw. It is the predictable gap left by an environment that didn't teach you that your needs were worth voicing. Trait 8. A tendency to apologize for your own existence. You say sorry more than the situation calls for. You preface your needs with justifications. You minimize your pain before anyone has questioned it. You make yourself smaller, more compact, less space-taking. Not because you've been asked to, but because the instinct to reduce the impact of your presence runs so automatically you barely notice it. On the surface, this can look like politeness, like being considerate of others, like humility. But the specific pattern of habitual self-minimization, the reflexive apology, the preemptive shrinking, has a very particular root. It develops when a child has learned through repeated experience that their full presence is too much, that their emotions create work for others, that being visibly themselves, taking up the space a human being naturally takes, leads to responses that communicate, "You are a lot." The apology becomes a preemptive strategy. If I make myself smaller before anyone objects, the objection may never come. If I apologize for needing before anyone sighs at the need, the sigh is less likely to arrive. If I shrink enough, I might stay below the threshold of what makes me inconvenient. The tragedy of this strategy is not that it is irrational. In the environment where it was developed, it probably worked. It reduced friction. It managed the emotional temperature of a household that didn't have room for a child's full experience. But in adult life, it costs. It costs in relationships where a partner cannot reach you because you will not fully occupy the space. It costs in professional contexts where your presence and perspective disappear before they can have impact. It costs in your own inner life, where the habit of minimizing yourself eventually makes it hard to know what you actually are beneath all the reduction. You are not too much. The environment was too small. Trait 9. Finding it easier to be needed than to be loved. You know how to be the person people rely on. You're good at it. When someone needs you, you show up. Fully, reliably, in a way that people around you have come to count on. And there is something in the being needed that feels like safety, like a confirmed place in someone's life. Being loved is different. It is harder. Not because you don't want it, but because it is more uncertain. Being loved means someone's feelings toward you are independent of what you do for them. They stay not because you are useful, but because of who you are. And who you are, as after a childhood of not being sure that who you are was enough, is exactly the ground that feels least stable. On the surface, being reliable and indispensable looks like a virtue, and it is. But the preference for being needed over being loved, the way need provides a security that love cannot quite replicate, is something very specific. It comes from having learned love as conditional. If love arrived through performance, through usefulness, through being the easy child, or the helpful one, or the one who didn't require much, then the experience of unconditional love, love that simply rests on who you are, has no internal template to match. It feels unstable precisely because it doesn't have the transaction at its center. Being needed has a logic. It has a mechanism. You provide value. They keep you. It is not beautiful, but it is predictable. And predictable, for someone who grew up without the predictability of love, can feel like the closest available approximation. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not for what you provide. But knowing that and feeling safe with it are two different things, and the distance between them is the distance between the adult you are and the child you were. A child who never fully learned that they were worth loving for nothing more than being themselves. Trait 10. A complicated relationship with your own story. When you talk about your childhood, if you talk about it at all, you do something specific. You minimize, you add disclaimers. You say, "It wasn't that bad," or "My parents did their best," or "I know other people had it worse," and these things may all be true, but they arrive so quickly, so automatically, that they function less as reflections than as defenses, a preemptive move to prevent anyone, including yourself, from sitting too long with the possibility that something real was missed. On the surface, this looks like perspective, like not being self-pitying, like having processed your history and arrived at a reasonable equanimity about it. But the speed and consistency of the minimization, the way the disclaimer arrives before the experience has even been named, is itself information. It is the behavior of someone who learned early that their pain was not sanctioned, that it was too much to acknowledge, that the appropriate response to their own experience was to reduce it to something more manageable, more justifiable, less demanding of a response. Psychologists call this narrative foreclosure, the way we edit our own story before we have fully processed it in order to avoid emotions or implications we are not yet ready to face. It is particularly common in people who grew up feeling unloved, because the full acknowledgement of what was missing carries with it a grief that was never permitted and a loss that was never named. You are allowed to have complicated feelings about your childhood. You are allowed to hold the truth that your parents did their best alongside the truth that their best left something in you unmet. Both things can be true. You do not have to resolve the contradiction before you are allowed to grieve it. 10 traits. Not symptoms, not diagnoses. Just the shapes that develop when a human being grows up in an environment where the felt experience of love was unreliable or absent. None of them are permanent. None of them are the final word on who you are. But none of them can be addressed by simply deciding to feel differently, because they were written into the nervous system at a time before decision was possible. What I want to say, as clearly as I can, The child who grew up in that environment drew a conclusion that felt logical at the time given the evidence. The conclusion was, I am not enough. There is something about me that makes me not worth the full version of love. That conclusion was wrong, not because you are perfect, not because there is nothing about you that needs to grow or change, but because the conclusion was based on a false premise, that a parent's capacity for love is a measure of a child's worth. It is not. You are not the proof that you are unlovable. You are the proof that love was withheld. Those are not the same thing, and the distance between those two sentences is the distance between a wound and a misunderstanding. And it matters enormously which one you are carrying. If this video names something you have carried for a long time without quite being able to name it, sit with that. You don't have to do anything with it yet. You just have to let it be true. And if this felt like a description of someone you know, consider sharing it with them. Sometimes the most healing thing is simply being told that what you feel has a name, and that the name belongs to something that happened to you, not something that is fundamentally wrong with you. Take care of yourself. We'll see you in the next one.